Greetings to everyone. Welcome, wherever you are, to this online discussion, which has been organized jointly by the Grantham Institute and the Department of Gender Studies. And it is we have 5 excellent speakers talking about a topic, which is, of course, assuming greater and greater importance. And that is, how do we deliver a gender-inclusive climate transition? And the focus today will be on India. What I would like to, I'm Professor Naila Kabeer. I work at the Department for International Studies, and I'm on the faculty of the International Inequalities Institute. I would like to just remind people that, we will be having these very interesting discussions, but there will be time for you to ask questions at the end. And please do use the question and answer feature. Post your names and organizations, and then the question that you find useful. I'd like you to also know that today's webinar is being recorded. So let me very briefly introduce our 5 panelists. We start with Reema Nanavaty, and I will give you a more detailed account of who she is, from SEWA, Dr. Garima Sahai, Dr. Suravi Nayak, Dr. Sohini Kar, and Dr. Swamprabha Das. And I would like to start off by asking Dr. Reema Nanavaty to give us a keynote address for about 10 minutes. So Reema, over to you.
Namaste. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And giving me an opportunity to speak here on behalf of our 2.9 million SEWA members. These are the poorest of the poor women workers from the informal economy in India. These women have always been the largely and the most severely affected victims of climate change. And yet, we have seen that they have always been the first responders, adapters, and the solution finders on day-to-day basis, using their own resources and technological know-how. Therefore, our experience at SEWA shows that instead of us developing programs for climate action, if we support these women workers and their organizations, their climate action will naturally and most economically yet effectively bring women center stage and enable far more significant achievement on the climate front. How can one do this? And that is by supporting, encouraging, and promoting women's contribution to climate action, to the economy and the ecology. This has to be considered by the authorities, the private sector, and the development finance institutions. Let me share how we at SEWA are doing it. On April 12, 2022, when SEWA was celebrating its 50 years, on this occasion, the message from our founder, Ila Bhatt, was that the real celebration will be that when we plan for the next 50 years. And in order to do that, how do you build resilience of the younger generation women workers, members of SEWA, against the myriad challenges of climate crisis? And therefore, SEWA has launched the Building Cleaner Skies, or the Swachh Akash campaign, to bring awareness on climate action amongst its 2.9 million women and their households. Let me show you a small video regarding the same. May we have the video, please?
During our 50 years journey of organizing the women workers in the informal economy, we have faced so many crises: political crisis, social crisis, and economic crisis. So collective organized strength is our asset, and Hum Sab Ek Hai is our value. And it is only through this we are able to overcome such crises and challenges. So during our 50-year celebration, our founder Ila Ben and 2.5 million members of SEWA emphasized to focus on the years to come, the generations to come, and the challenges to come. I very clearly remember that Ilaben called me once telling, Jyoti, let us clean our sky. Because access to clean and healthy environment is a fundamental right, not for just humanity, but all life on earth. And that was the paradigm moment.
આપણા વાતાવરણમાં દિવસે ને દિવસે બદલાવ આવી રહ્યા છે અને તેની ગંભીર અસરો આપણા કામદારો અને શ્રમજીવીના રોજગાર અને જીવન પર વ્યાપક રીતે પડી રહી છે. પણ શું તેનાથી આપણે ચૂપચાપ બેસી રહેવાનું, આ બધી અસરો ભોગવ્યા કરવાની અને બીજા કોઈની મદદની રાહ જોવાની?
આપણે ઘણી બધી સમસ્યાઓને પડકારોનો સામનો કરે છે. એ પછી આપણી હોય, ગામની હોય કે દેશની હોય. હમ સબ એક હે એ સેવાનો જ નારો નહીં, પણ એના ગુણ અને મૂલ્ય છે. એકતા, સમાનતા અને સંગઠિતતાનો પડકો છે.
આપણા ઇલાબેન કહીને ગયા છે, હમ સબ એક હે. એ મૂલ્યથી માત્ર નાત, જાત, ધર્મ, આર્થિક અસમાનતા જ નહીં, પણ પૃથ્વી પરના પ્રત્યેક જીવો વચ્ચે સમાનતા લાવવા તરફ પગલા ભરીશું.
આપણે સર્જેલી કુદરતી અસમાનતા આપણે સંબળ વડે જ દૂર કરવાની છે. આપણે શ્રમજીવી છે તો શું થઈ ગયું? આપણા દરેકનો આ પ્રશ્ન છે. એટલે જ આપણે સ્વચ્છ આકાશની ઝુંબેશ શરૂ કરી છે. સ્વસ્થ પર્યાવરણ અને સ્વચ્છ આકાશ એ પ્રત્યેક જીવનો મૂળભૂત અધિકાર છે.
Thank you. So today, after 20 months of launching the Cleaner Skies campaign, SEWA has finalized its campaign strategy that focuses on creating awareness on three major aspects. What has led to climate change? What are the effects of climate change on our members? And what adaptation and mitigation measures do we need to take to build the resilience of our members against these climate change impacts? With these messages, SEWA has and will continue reaching out to the poor informal workers' households across 18 states in India, and we will do this most urgently. Nature has shown that we should not get overconfident about the climate situation. It is only going to accelerate and continue harming more women and their livelihoods much aggressively. And therefore, we must anticipate that such ever expanding emergency and put women in the center of all climate work and action. Actions that transforms our economy from fuel economy to economy of nurturance. Therefore, SEWA will not just stop at awareness, but we need to strengthen women's climate action too. Let me share two examples of the climate action by women. We call it as our Haryala Gaon or the Green Villages, and Surya, the Green Skilling Program. The women and their collectives, whether they are self-help groups under Sakhi Mandal or the agriculture program or the health program, they do household level energy planning and budgeting, which is then consolidated at the hamlet level and at the village level. This gives a clear idea on how much time and resources a household spends on accessing its energy needs for domestic as well as mechanical consumption, for livelihoods, for farming, for mobility. And then a menu of green and clean technology solutions, which is identified, which includes cool rooftop solar, biogas, solar precision irrigation pumps, trap lights, solar fencing, and electric mobility. The climate entrepreneurs of SEWA then create awareness about such green technology and energy solutions and help the households select the energy tools depending on their priority and affordability, aggregate the demands, and facilitates bank or financial linkages, vendor linkages, and installation, repairs, and maintenance of these green technology at the doorstep. In the process, we also aim to create modern, decent, and dignified green livelihood opportunities for the rural youth, not at the cost of existing skills and livelihoods. This has very clearly shown that therefore the solutions also has to have a multi-pronged approach. Increase in adoption of green technology solutions in the rural areas would lead to creation of green jobs, but calls for increased green skilled workers too, and therefore the need for investing in green skilling. Surya, which is a partnership with UNEP and Renew Power, we are working on training the young women from the villages as green technicians. This cadre of green technicians become climate entrepreneurs or are absorbed by the renewable energy companies. These initiatives of SEWA under the Cleaner Skies campaign show that women-led any aspect of climate action, be it building resilience, adaptation, or mitigation, if it is led by women, is one of the surest way to accelerate climate action. Our women are ready, but is the society ready? That's a big question. I would also like to add and conclude by saying that how do we enable the tiny and micro entrepreneurs to be able to access the green carbon credit to scale up their climate action and make it sustainable? What we want is a micro carbon credit movements of carbon savings groups of women urgently. That's a new form of organizing women. Scaling up of such women-led climate action also calls for investment, be it the loss and damage fund or the climate mitigation fund. SEWA has already piloted such climate resilience fund. And last but very important is that such investment should be locally governed, especially through women's unions and cooperatives, and in the sectors where women have large presence, such as artisans, agriculture, water, shelter, construction, and home-based work. In areas where women do not have large presence, such as new technologies, priority needs to be given to promote women and their unions and cooperatives. And therefore, I would just end by saying what our members always re-emphasize is that we shall overcome. We shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, we do believe we shall overcome someday. Thank you so much. I hope I stuck to my time, Naila ji.
You did, Reena ji, very nicely. And before I ask you a couple of questions, I did say I would do short introductions, but I think yours was a little too short. So let me just tell our audience that you're the Executive Director of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, SEWA, and you've been working with SEWA for over 36 years. Now, I know SEWA dates back to the early 70s, and the fact that it is still around and still thriving, I think suggests that it exemplifies some of the values that we are now looking at. Resilience, adaptability. You've talked about the many crises that SEWA has had to confront over the years, but you've still survived and you've still flourished. So It is now the largest, perhaps in the world, union of informal workers, and largely women. And it has also been a founding member of WIGO, the Women in the Informal Economy Organizing and Globalizing. So we are all very proud of SEWA and the fact that it has come through all of this. And I thought what was interesting, there were two things that I wanted to pick up. One is the quote from Ilaben, that development is not a project. It is a process of trying to bring in harmony and balance between people, communities, and nature. And I think that is something that is coming to the forefront. I think the other thing that struck me about what you said is, that we talk about scale, right? But there are different ways of scale. So one scale is when you begin large scale, and then you expect things to trickle down to the bottom. I think the SEWA model is you begin on the ground with small scale initiatives, and then you work out how to scale them up. So I think these are two of the points that I really took away from your talk. In terms of a couple of questions, Reema, just another few minutes. One is, there's SEWA, and then there's the rest of India, right? So somehow you have to reach out to all the informal workers and vulnerable households in other parts of India. So what are the priority areas that SEWA has in ensuring that these investments, not just your investment in your climate fund, but the government and international, is going to priorities in terms of helping these groups of people that you work with to build resilience in both extreme and slow onset climate change? So that's one question. It's really about how does SEWA amplify its influence to make sure that it's, reaching others as well. And then in the context of emerging climate finance and green opportunities, I think you've mentioned it in your talk. How do we ensure that women don't get left behind? Poorer women don't get left behind? Because we are going to be seeing a shift in strategic thinking. But we don't want to see a repetition of the past, where the vulnerable, the poor, whose voices are not being heard. So SEWA is amplifying their voices. But could you let us know about your thoughts on making sure we don't get left behind, not we, women in India?
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate how well you put our values, in together. And I think we come together as poor, as women, and as workers, no matter what caste, community, or religion we belong to. And I think that keeps the fabric of our organization, which is now turned into a movement, intact. And in order to amplify our voices, our visibility as well, and also, how do you influence? I think if 93% of the workforce in India is in the informal sector, we are the mainstream. The rest 7% therefore has to learn how do they partner with the mainstream 93% of the workforce. And I think that's where the campaigns like Building Cleaner Skies or the Swachh Akash will play a major role. That how do the governments, the financial institutions, the developmental institutions, the authorities, they also learn that how do they have to think of not just trickling down, but how do they partner with the 93% of the workforce? And that's what is going to be the key. And that's where campaigns play a big role. So if I'm educating and making aware 3 million households, which means that if you consider every household with 5 members, it's like, I'm reaching out to 15 million. And that's, I think, the voice would be loud and clear. And the second approach that we have seen is that when the poor and the women, they see that, their voices are being heard, their issues are being addressed, they organically bring more and more women and their households into the movement. And therefore, I think one big message that we all have to understand is that poverty is also a form of violence with the consent of the society. And climate is further compounding that poverty. And therefore, I think the way one has to see that how do you ensure that women and the poor do not get left behind? Is that poor and the women do not want charity? All they want is enabling environment so that they are able to lift themselves out and fight out the climate change on their own. And I think that's where I would come to, the last quote of Ilaben that we all saw, that it has to be in harmony with, the nature. I think this is the moment, it's a critical moment. It's not just to save our lives, but if we don't come together now and don't bring women and the poor in the center stage, I do not think countries like ours would be able to fight climate change and accelerate the pace of transition.
Thank you very much. And I think your point about the informal economy, it's not just true of India, many countries in the global south. And I'm surprised that for the long time, the ILO still talked about standard employment, by which they meant the formal economy, whereas really the standard in a lot of these countries is informal work. And lots of different organizations and institutions are going to be involved in this new challenge, in this emerging challenge. But I'm glad that we started out with workers and informal workers and their associations, because I think that issue of voice, we no longer have an option of apathy. That issue of voice is going to become increasingly important. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Dr. Garima Sahai, who is Research Associate at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. I am going to ask her a couple of questions. I know that she's aware of these questions, but let me just for the audience's benefit. Garima, could you elaborate on the reasons behind the low labor force participation of women in India, the very difficulties in retaining them in the labor force, particularly in sectors like agriculture, industry, manufacturing, the STEM research, and energy? And I'm going to go on to my second question, because I think you have addressed it. As India transitions to a cleaner economy, what strategies can be implemented to avoid replicating existing segregation in the labor market? So both of these questions are about work in the sectors that are going to become increasingly important.
Thanks, Naila. Let me try to respond to those questions through a presentation, and hopefully this will...
You happen to have prepared.
Yes, which I happen to have prepared. Let me just see if... Is that visible? Okay, great. So let me structure my response into three. One, I just want to quickly speak about the context that we're having this discussion in. What has women's participation in the labor market really looked like in India, which Naila has already kind of alluded to. And then I want to look to the future and think about what women's participation might look like in the green transition. And then what is there to do about it? What can be done about it? Right. So women's participation in the labor market in India, unfortunately, has been low, and by many accounts, it's been declining. So it was about 37% in 2004-05, which successively declined to 21% in 2019. And several explanations have been put forward for this, including rise in household incomes. So since women are often thought of as secondary earners, they withdraw from the labor market when household incomes increase, or rise in education levels amongst women. So that means that the extra time, the time that they're spending in education is time away from the labor market, et cetera, et cetera. But really, the key explanation that studies have found is of occupational gender segregation. And the argument is that the industries that have grown and are projected to have high employment growth in the future, construction, even the parts in agriculture, logistics, etc., are male-dominated and non-traditional for women in India. So what they're saying is that even with jobs coming up, to whatever extent they're coming up, women are not being able to enter them. Women are not being able to participate in these jobs, and it's the statistic is kind of noteworthy. 42 to 62%, depending on the time period that one is looking at, is 42 to 62% of the drop in female labor force participation, depending on the time period that one is looking at, is explained by occupational gender segregation. So now I want to kind of look to the future and think about what women's participation in the green economy may look like. And I want to start with saying that a lot of people tend to talk about green jobs as a separate, distinct category of jobs, which pose entirely new challenges. But what I'd like to say is that barriers to green jobs for women overlap with barriers to jobs for women as they have been. So social norms that impeded women from entering jobs so far are likely to continue to impede their participation even in the green economy. And as far as green skills tend to be STEM-based, and STEM is male-dominated, a rise in green jobs could actually mean increased occupational gender segregation, which would in turn mean lower women's participation in the labor market if things were to continue as they have been. So the implication really is the key point that I'm trying to make here is that women's entry into male-dominated job training and then thereafter entry into the job is critical. Right, so what can we do about it? What are some of the strategies for supporting women's entry into non-traditional job training? So there are quite a few things that can be considered, but let me focus on two. One is around job-related information poverty. So women, and especially young women, and I'm focusing on young women because India is one of the youngest countries in the world, experience acute job-related information poverty. Information about male jobs is even harder to come by. So, so in this kind of a context where job-related information itself shapes entry, it itself shapes occupational outcomes, that needs to be addressed. And how should that be addressed? Bring information about non-traditional jobs to women. And I say this because women, especially young women from low-income households in particular, face a lot of mobility constraints. So in the short term, we need to take information to them. Removing those mobility constraints will take some time. And how can this information be delivered? Do it at places that they already go to. So say local markets that they already visit, or schools can be important spaces to provide job-related information. And the second strategy, or to borrow Reema ji's term, enabling environment factor that I'd like to speak about is parental support. Parental support seems to be key to young women's participation in the labor market. It makes them feel that doing male work is acceptable to do, whatever the wider society might think. And especially mothers' support is very important here. And this informs strategies because, you know, if strategies only target women themselves, if they only target young women, then they won't be entirely effective. Parents need to be targeted as well, especially mothers need to be targeted as well. They need to be counseled. And the overall point that I'm trying to make here is that it's really factors which are embedded in women's daily lives that end up determining their occupational outcomes. So any effective strategy will really need to focus on that, on micro factors. I'll stop there. I hope I've stuck to the 5-minute mark.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. And again, I think, you know, reiterating the point I made earlier, that the new challenges that are facing us as we realize what we're facing really has to be a whole society effort. So we've talked about workers' associations and so on, and now we're talking about young aspirants to the labor market. And I think what you're saying is the changes that have to begin very early. School, I think, remains important, but of course, parents, counselors, community workers, and all of that. What I think I would like to know, though, is what about thinking about we talk about gender segmentation of the labor market, and you're right to say that segmentation will continue to be a problem. But I think we also need to think about the kinds of green jobs in which women have already a comparative advantage. So the whole reproductive economy, agriculture, waste making, all of these. So I would like us to think both about removing barriers to women's entry into the kind of jobs that are going to emerge, but also about rethinking the structure of occupations in a way that favors, because many of these jobs, the green jobs, are very favorable or hospitable to women. So that was my kind of, and I'd also like to see some of that education going to men. Yeah, we want to train women up to these new STEM, etc., but we want to train men to take caring responsibilities and caring about nature and caring about people a little bit more seriously. So maybe we can have a conversation about that at some stage.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think I see that as two sides of the same coin. Women entering male roles and men entering traditionally female roles. I'm not sure if one can really happen effectively in a sustainable way if the other doesn't.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Garima. I'm now going to turn to our third speaker, Suravi Nayak, who is an associate fellow with the Sustainable Futures Collaborative Research Foundation in Delhi. She's in the process of completing her PhD. And Suravi, would you like me to ask the questions at the beginning together?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So here's the question. Suravi works a lot on the political economy of coal dependency and coal transition. Of course, we're all focusing on these fossil fuels and so on. So it's a hugely important topic. So here's the questions, Suravi. How are women marginalized in India's coal economy? And are there risks that these trends, this marginalization, will continue as we move towards clean energy? It goes back, I think, to Garima's point, that the barriers to women's participation are going to continue, even if we move away from the old kind of industries to the new ones. So how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen? And what recommendations could you make sure that women are active participants in this transition away from coal?
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, a big thanks to the organizers for having me here. And thank you, Naila, for asking those very important and interesting questions. So as we all know, can move to the next slide, please. As we all know that just transition planning and discussions have gained traction after COP27. And India is in initial phase of thinking about just energy transition and planning about it. But however, there is a male biased discourse of energy transition that we see emerging. And so here is a trap that there may be a repetition of gender injustices that is already existing in the coal economies, and we are certainly at the risk of repeating those injustices even in the clean energy sector. So, to begin with, why there is a male bias discourse of energy transition in the country. So there are two reasons which I would say are contributing to this sort of negligence towards women in the coal ecosystem. First, there is lack of information on the role or on the involvement of women in the coal ecosystem, which is also because of the reason that women have very limited presence in the formal workforce. For example, in Coal India Limited, hardly 8% of the employees are actually women. And because of which, so now there is this emerging discourse around just transition. There are a number of studies coming up, which is looking at the rehabilitation of coal workers, but at the same time, they're only focusing on the male members because of this limited presence of women in the formal workforce. And even if we see discussion or mention of gender as a category, it is operating much as a checklist. And second reason of such kind of male bias discourse of energy transition is because of the failure to recognize the role of women in energy transition. So now we see that, I mean, already before me, two speakers have also talked about the role of women in clean energy ecosystem. So there is a lot of emphasis on the role of or the participation of women in the clean energy ecosystem. But as we know, in India, the development of clean energy system, to say the renewables, are taking place in either western or southern part of the country, whereas the coal ecosystem lies spatially a very different location, that is in the central and eastern part of the country. So there is a disconnect between these two conversations, bringing emphasizing on the role of women in the clean energy sector, but at the same time, like we have not recognized that there are women in the coal ecosystem who are completely away from such kind of discussions or deliberations. So, as Kuntala Lahiri Dutt has argued in one of her recent articles, we should not just focus on gender just transition, but we need to move beyond it. That is towards gender transformative transition away from coal. And to do that, we need to first of all understand what is the status of women in the coal ecosystem, and second, recognize the implications of energy transition for women in coal communities. Next slide, please. So, based on my long-term field work in one of the major coal-producing state in Eastern India, that is Orissa. So, what I have found is that, which may also resonate with many of the points that the earlier speakers have made, women face multiple barriers when it comes to coal labor market. First and foremost, the barrier is to enter the labor market, which is like majority of women are not able to enter the coal-based formal workforce itself. Then the second barrier is distribution barrier. If at all, like I talked about in my previous slide, a woman do enter the coal labor market, enter the formal workforce, then there is a disproportionate representation of women in unskilled or very insecure jobs. And third, we see that there is there is gender wage gap. For example, in CIL itself, among non-executive, there is 27.5% of wage gap existing. And fourth, there is a representation barrier, which means that women in the sector, in the coal ecosystem, do not have proper mechanisms to negotiate, to bargain. So, because of their absence in the trade unions and also in the executive positions in the coal industry. So, we see that labor of women in the coal ecosystem is marginalized and invisible in many ways. And this labor is also shaped by intersectional patterns and a lot of a wide variety of like patriarchal norms around the jobs. And among those patriarchal norms, land ownership becomes very or plays a very important role, because in many of these like coal geographies, we see that the formal jobs are offered to the land title holders as compensation, whereas women do not hold those land titles, and they are in that way excluded from that formal workforce altogether. So, based on my study, what I have found is that there are three patterns of labor in the coal ecosystem. So, first and foremost, more than 50% of women do engage in social reproductive labor, or in other words, unpaid care work. Then, second, foremost engagement of women is in informal casual labor within the coal ecosystem, highly precarious, highly exploitative, and coal scavenging within the coal mines or nearby mining area. And fourth, as I have already talked about, women do engage in formal jobs in a very limited manner, but again end up doing very precarious and menial jobs. For example, in the blasting section, or as a peon in the office, offering in coffees to the executives and so on. So next slide, please. So given that there are these three patterns of invisible and marginalized labor of women in the whole ecosystem, and as Naila asked this question as well, like how do we ensure that these women are not left behind, and we achieve a gender transformative energy transition? So we have to first and foremost ensure that gender justice is at the center of the just transition discourse. And when I speak of transformation, it's just not a one-way transformation that I speak of, but it's a two-way transformation between gender equity and energy transition, where women should be seen as active participant or change agents towards the energy transition, and at the same time, it should also bring gender equal conditions. So based on four pillars of justice that is discussed in literature, on just transition, which is starting from recognition justice to procedural justice, distributive justice, and restorative justice, there are four immediate priorities that I have identified. Next slide, please. So first, priority areas are to recognize and to ensure representation. So we have to recognize that there exists this excluded, marginalized, invisible labor force in the coal economy. And using intersectionality informed framework, we have to identify what are the contributions of these women to the coal economy, and what are the vulnerabilities. So this specific targeting is completely missing from the ongoing discourse around rehabilitation of workforce or just energy transition in the country. Then second, we have to ensure that they are represented well enough in the just transition planning process. Already, we have heard from Reema ji about SEWA, collective action, and so on. So existing this very strong women organizations or local women networks, self-help groups in respective coal states, we could ensure from these communities that women do amplify their voices, and we have a bottom-up approach to just transition policy planning. Next slide, please. And there are last 2 points which I have identified as priority areas to target women as the change agents of the transition. So there is a lot of discussion about shift from coal to renewables, or coal to other productive sectors like agriculture or MSME and so on. So this thinking need a gender focus. We need to think about gender inclusive or gender led economic diversification in the coal region. Whereas we plan for women-led MSMEs or any other endeavors that we plan for, and even the existing schemes which are there in this states, that could be leveraged and ensure that women are also included in the thinking about income generating activities. And fourth is, like I have already mentioned, like women in these coal communities have to be identified as change agents. And this is again a two-way transformation, where we ensure that there are gender equal conditions being created by their economic participation, but at the same time also it acts as kind of cooling capacity to reduce the resistance or to reduce the kind of socio-economic shocks that this households would be experiencing in the future. So I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to the questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Suravi. I think you've picked on a topic that reveals some of the very contradictory pressures that we are now going to be under. So you've got a coal industry, which is, you talked about the central and eastern part of India, and many jobs and a great deal of the economy has relied on it. But we're now being asked to move away from coal to clean energy. And of course, there will be resistance because particularly that picture of yours, I think you used the word scavenging, a lot of women doing scavenging, which means they're on the absolute margins of this industry. But even this industry is going to be taken away from them. And of course, that photograph of them, well, the woman with the child on her back, is one of the reasons why she's always scavenging rather than being a part of the mainstream of the coal industry. So I think there's a real challenge for us academics and for activists and scholars. That is, how do we move to this transition without penalizing those people who rely on the livelihoods that we are moving away from? And I think you're touching on that, and you're talking about, the likelihood of resistance, because this is what few people have. But, when we talk about restorative justice and so on, these are very big issues. And so I hope, as we move forward, we can unpack them to work out what they mean in practical terms, in policy terms, in civil society terms. But really, I think this is a very interesting topic because it provides jobs, because it's contributing to climate disaster, because we have to find alternatives, and because even on the margins of this job, you're finding very poor women with their children trying to eke out a living. So I hope we'll hear more from you in the future about how you're working out these challenges. Did you have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Naila, on this. And especially picking on the point on restorative justice is sometimes like when we try to work around these 4 pillars of justice, there could be contradictions and also there could be complements with each other. And even if we take the actual definition of restorative justice, which is to restore to restore the previous environment and so on, that kind of contradicts to when we try to think about women in the coal communities, because if we are to take that particular definition and think about restorative justice, it implies that again, although focusing on the economic participation, be it in agricultural work and so on, but again without access to land or land ownership. So through this talk also, I was trying to think that how restorative justice itself, the definition could be rethought when we think about gender justice in the coal ecosystem, or be it in clean energy sector. Yeah.
Good. Well, we'll continue talking on this. So thank you very much, Suravi. I'd now like to turn to our fourth speaker, Dr. Sohini Kar, my colleague at the Department of International Development, where she's associate professor. She's an anthropologist who's worked particularly in South Asia and India on financialization and its impact on poverty. And her current research is on activism in financial markets. So Sohini, she should be beamed up.
I'm just going to share my screen here. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I know that you've prepared your presentation accordingly. So one is, of course, reflecting on India's history with social banking. Do you think women have adequate access to the expanding pool of climate finance, which is a whole new sector? And what are the major barriers that limit women's access to climate finance? And what are the solutions that have been proposed to address this challenge? Over to you, Sohini.
Thanks, Naila. I'm just going to share a screen here with some slides to answer or try to answer these questions. So just to go back to this actual history of social banking, and I think it's something that is not as widely known in terms of what is actually meant by social banking And so, of course, post-independence the banking sector was aligned with state-led development, but the focus was on large-scale industry, and the credit tended to go to capital-rich industrialists. So in the late 1960s, when there was push for bank nationalization, and I drawn these quotes from Indira Gandhi when she was giving a speech to bankers, and she explained that she thought that banks saw things in a particular light, which was a little bit removed from the needs of the country, and that rather creditworthiness was of purpose rather than person. So here, what's really important to this idea of social banking is that the purpose of financing matters, not the individual, whether the individual can pay back the loan or not. But does that purpose serve the needs of the country? And so this discourse led to the nationalization of 14 banks in 1969 and another 6 in 1980, where public sector banks controlled 92% of the market for banking services. So again, you see the role of the state in sort of directing credit where it was seen as previously not going. And in 1991, of course, we have liberalization, and there is this process of liberalization and privatization of the financial sector. But what it's worth reiterating is that social banking remains part of the Indian banking system. So despite liberalization, it still remains a component of Indian banking, which I think is distinct in this kind of neoliberal era. And so when we're talking about social banking, one of the key parts of it is what's known as priority sector lending. And priority sector lending, again, social banking is this attempt to make financial services a part of the planned economy, such that banks can allocate credit to not just capital-rich industrialists, but to a broad range of actors, including farmers and marginalized sectors. What priority sector lending allows is for the state, under the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, to set targets for banks to lend to specific areas that are deemed necessary for economic and social development. So again, despite liberalization, social banking, including this kind of strategy of using priority sector lending, remains an integral part of the Indian banking system. And this is just to explain what is meant by priority sector lending, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but essentially this is from the Reserve Bank of India's directives. And what it says is that for large domestic and commercial banks, as well as foreign banks that have a larger presence in the country, 40% of credit has to go towards what are designated priority sector. And if they don't meet these targets, that percentage is then given to certain banks that already do these kinds of targeted lending. So banks have freedom to lend within these sectors that are identified. These are not all of the sectors, but just some of the key ones. And the sort of directed amounts that need to go to each of these sectors. So agriculture obviously is one of the largest sectors that is identified, but there are also advances to weaker sectors as well. So when we look at social banking and climate finance, there are a set of revised guidelines, and these revised, they state in this revised guidelines that it aims to encourage and support environment-friendly lending policies to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a sort of move to incorporate climate issues within the guidelines for priority sector lending. And in 2015, there was the introduction of renewable energy as part of priority sector lending. So this has a couple of ways. The first, initially, there was 15 crores were allocated to borrowers for renewable energy, such as solar generators or micro hydroelectric pumps. But there was actually low uptake, and this led to increasing the loan amount to 30 crores. Individual households can also access loans up to 10 lakhs for renewable energy. So this is sort of the key area that is directly focused on climate issues, which is to have lending for renewable energy. We do see climate finance tied into other parts of priority sector lending, such as agriculture. So the idea that, there are sort of adaptive mechanisms in agriculture, and this could be going to it, but it's not directly sort of framed as such, but is seen as sort of indirectly could be addressing some of these climate issues. But again, there's no direct focus on climate beyond the renewables for priority sector lending at the moment. Well, we can turn then to the sort of issue around gender and whether there's gender-specific credit. When we look at the sort of breakdown of weaker sections, so again, this idea that priority sector lending can go to particularly sort of weaker sections of society, we can see that on the one hand, there's specific targeting of individual women beneficiaries. So there is a specific sort of targeting of women as borrowers. But also it does target self-help groups, which has come up in a couple of the speakers before as well. And often a lot of self-help groups, though not exclusively, a large number are women-led. And so that becomes, again, an indirect way of sort of targeting credit towards women through what is known as a process of on-lending. So again, the banks aren't directly lending to these women, but they lend indirectly through self-help groups, through microfinance institutions. So you have this process of sort of targeting credit to women, but through this kind of process of what is known as on-lending. When we look at gender and access to credit, women have an increased access to credit in India through financial inclusion strategies, including priority sector lending. And we see this in things such as the growth of microfinance. Overall, there has been a growth in women's access to credit, but a large but what is interesting is that large loans remain in favor of men, which is to say we actually see a kind of segmentation of lending itself. So perhaps mirroring what we're seeing in the sort of labor market issues is the fact that while women have access to a growing number of pool of sort of credit, particularly sort of microcredit, they're not necessarily scaling up to be able to access larger amounts of credit. So what they can do with credit becomes limited to the scale of credit that they have access to. So again, we do see gendered access to credit in which women have increasing access to small loans through microfinance, while men continue to borrow both from informal lenders and from larger commercial lenders. We also see microfinance has increasingly been part of adaptation. So when we're looking at, what is sort of gender inclusive and access to finance in this case, there is significance of on lending into microfinance as part of priority sector lending. And this microfinance has been used for various adaptive mechanisms. There are some programs that directly address adaptation. So one group, Mahila Housing Trust, offers small loans to buy heat-reflecting white paint or roof panels to reduce heat absorption. So there are some groups that are sort of directly lending specifically for climate issues. But more, by and large, borrowers take loans to address existing and emergent climate risks, even when the loans are not explicitly made for that. So they might be doing it to tide over sort of various issues, to do sort of adaptive mechanisms themselves, but they're not borrowing specifically for that, or that's not what's stated on paper, but they might be doing that through the loans themselves. But it's worth noting that a reliance on credit for poor households increases the likelihood of increased debt burdens, debt spirals, particularly when faced with emergent climate risks, which is to say that because poor households are relying on credit to sort of see them through some of these climate catastrophes, that again is a financial risk in itself that they are then put into through this process. So while access to credit can be beneficial, it is also a high-risk strategy for households. So I'm just going to end with a couple of key takeaways. So overall, climate financing is not a key dimension of public priority sector lending, although some aspects are absorbed or addressed indirectly in the existing areas such as farming or social infrastructures. And the Reserve Bank is starting to consider more the impact of climate change on the economy at large. And so there's a new report from the central bank that's called Towards a Greener, Cleaner India. So, whether this climate issue is going to become this kind of purpose in the near future, I think is quite likely. How that might be extended into the priority sector lending will be a key issue. On the gender front, credit for women is expanding, but it's still limited, particularly when it comes to the size of loans. So the scale of projects is necessarily smaller. Credit-based financing for poor households increases the risk of over-indebtedness and debt spirals. And again, I think one of the things I do want to sort of emphasize, particularly coming out of my own previous research on microfinance as well, is that often these are, when women take out loans, they are paying interest on them. And so when we're asking poor households to take loans to adapt to climate catastrophes that have not been of their making, it's a specifically sort of key issue that we shouldn't sort of burden the poorest to indebt themselves more in order to just survive climate change. And I think there's an important need as we talk about climate financing to talk about things such as grants rather than just credit to poor households. So that's the end of my talk here.
Okay, thanks very much, Sohini. And I was really fascinated by the history of social banking in India. I think that's quite unusual. And that focus on the purpose rather than the individual. And I think that lends itself very nicely to looking at banking much more around the purpose of a just transition rather than, lending to individuals. And I really agree with your point about the grants, because it is so unfair that people who are dealing with crises not of their making are still being asked to bear the risk of it. And the other thing I think is that, the middle classes in the global south, including India, are now some of the greatest emitter in carbon emissions. And I'd really like us also to think more about what is going to be done about consumption patterns at that level. We're looking very much at poorer people, and they're not the ones that are the most, implicated in this. But as you say, they are often the ones who have to bear the greatest risks. So I think in the interest of time, thanks very much. And I'll move on to our last speaker. And this is Dr. Swayam Prabha Das, who is Associate Vice President and Lead for Policy Research and Planning Development Alternative Group in India. And so, Swayam, I'd like to ask you as well a couple of questions to structure your presentation. Based on the UNDP study that you led, what insights can you share about green jobs and eco-entrepreneurship opportunities for women in India? And secondly, what are the supportive policies needed to accelerate women's participation in the green economy? So some fairly important questions.
Yeah, thank you, Naila. The study that we did when I was with UNDP was essentially looking at green jobs and eco-entrepreneurship, which was part of the larger work that we were doing under Disha project, which was supported by IKEA Foundation at that point in time. And I realized that we really don't talk about green jobs. We talk about employment, entrepreneurship for women, opportunities for women. But that is when the whole climate narrative was building up. And this is, I'm talking about 2015, 16, that time. And we realized that there has to be a bridge that talks about women, how they can shift from normal employment opportunities or entrepreneurships to look at jobs or enterprises which are green in nature. So as there's a connect to that shift. And so I particularly looked at the national policy on skill development and entrepreneurship of the Government of India for 2015. And when I wanted to look up as what's happening in the green job sector, I just found just a mention of it. And I think that really triggered the urge to find out more and to see why are we not talking about green jobs, green entrepreneurship, women in those spaces. When you're talking about the policies, you're talking about transitions, and you're talking about how you need to shift or transform or transition to a different set of development that is also accelerated. So that was the thought behind undertaking this. And the sector that we looked at was essentially aligned to what the Green Job Sector Skill Council was looking at. But then I also went back and looked deeper into the UNDP work that we were doing across the globe. And we thought that we should look at not just renewable energy, we should look at green transport, green construction, the carbon sinks. I looked at forest and marine fisheries there, and water management. And I thought that these are the areas where women were participating more freely, and there is a potential and a possibility of expanding the women participation in these sectors. And so we initiated this study, and unfortunately, the COVID was upon us. So we had to kind of contain the study to more of secondary research. And then we thought that instead of doing a pan-India, which was not feasible at that time, we thought that maybe let's just look at the Disha project areas. That was NCR, Delhi, Haryana, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Telangana, and see what do we find there. And you would have, all of you would have by now kind of got it, that the first thing that we were faced with was the data availability. It was not there. So we started off on a back foot. There was no disaggregated data on gender-based, what women were doing in these areas, what was the sectors that you could look at. And that was one of the biggest challenges I think we faced when we were looking at it. And then when we looked, okay, we don't have it right now, but is there somewhere noted? So when we looked at it, there was limited sectoral specific historical data available. And we couldn't do it, but we know that women were there in renewable energy sector. They were beginning to come into the green transport sector. They were there in the green construction sector as laborers. They were there in the forestry. They were there in the marine fisheries sector, and they were doing water management because we had those informations there. But the challenge of getting it all together at one place to say that this is where women are, or these are the numbers, was just not happening. So we could not also come up with a very reliable projection to say that, okay, if we do this kind of skilling, reskilling, upscaling to help women transition, so what would be those projections and those growth? So even though those projections and growth were sectoral, but for women to find that bit was really, really difficult. So also there was a problem of getting those data from the informal and formal sectors, because we know women are more in the informal sectors in these green jobs. As is also, Reena ji has also spoken, other panelists have already spoken about it. So we were really, really constrained to see how it would happen. So this study is there on the website, and I would really encourage you all to take a look, with the disclaimer that it was a challenging time due to COVID. So, but there is a scope to build and take it forward. And if I looked at the data that was shared by Dr. Garima Sahai, is that women in the workforce has actually increased post-COVID. And today we see it at about 37%, which is such a great thing to see, because when I was working with Disha, we were like struggling at 21% of women in the workforce. And that is where the challenge lies, that could this report, which was prepared in 21, which is slightly limited, but can this pave a way for more additional work that we could do? Maybe look at how we can build that system of data that could actually lead to some policy shifts. What do we take to the policymakers? So I would look forward to hearing and seeing if we have more data that could come in and build our confirmations onto this. And essentially, it's also looking at what I felt a little uncomfortable was when we say that these sectors are for men and these sectors are for women. I think we need to kind of break that stereotype. And that is very important. Women need to choose what they want to do. They need not be in the STEM segment only to be a green entrepreneur. For me, that's very uncomfortable. They could come from social sector, they could come from otherwise also from a policy sector, and they could build that entire conversation. So it's a shift in the mindset that we also need. And this is the report that allowed many of us to actually think that how can you look at women who cannot be just clubbed as saying that, oh, this is only for you. But how do we enable that? So Disha actually opened a lot of portfolios or platforms where shifts were being made within the private sector to allow for women to be on the factory floors with a toilet facility, which was never there, post training to the men, making sure that women have a transport, a mobility to pick and drop, and also how do you convince them to have a creche within their units? And how do you ensure pay package similarity? So how do you remove those inequalities to allow for that systems to flourish? So I think when you're talking about green transition, these platforms, these enabling ecosystems are very, very important, and they're very conducive to making those shifts. Otherwise, we will be staggering somewhere or the other. I'll come now to the second part of your question, where you are asking what the policy accelerations are that we need, and I have already touched upon some of them. And at Development Alternatives, we also work with women at the grassroots, with employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. The three major messages that we get is that when you bring women into the workforce, green segments, green jobs, you need to first listen to them. You need to allow them to think and come up with solutions. You cannot force feed solutions to them. So you need to tell, because if you look at it historically, women have been the custodians of nature-based actions, activities, be it water, be it food security, be it energy. So women have been the natural custodians, and they are the nurturers. So probably what comes from them is more lasting. So you need to enable women and listen to them to come up with the solutions to the local problems that they may be facing, and which is not like one solution fits all kind of a thing. So it has to be customized. And we saw that when we were working with the women in the e-rickshaw segment, and they were given this opportunity to decide for themselves what they want to do. And that actually helped to move that needle a bit, to build their confidence, and also to make them more financially, economically empower them, and also build the whole capital around a social structure to enable them to move forward in their lives also. The second point that we learned, and we are learning from the work that we're doing, is women need to be part of the critical sectors. So it cannot be, and they have to be the catalyst of change when we talk about waste management, we talk about energy, we talk about construction, but what at the value chain? Where is the right fit? That is what we need to think about. You cannot push them back like we see in the marine fisheries sector, where the men go out to fish and women are the ones who are sorting and selling them in the markets. So do we have women fishermen, fisher folks in the sea? I haven't seen one in a long, long time. But can we change that narrative? Or do you allow them to choose to be there? So that's one point that is very important, that where do you put them in the value chain, where they are good at, where they would like to be. And the third thing that we learned is the assets and the infrastructures that's been created. How do you provide the opportunity for women to actually hold them, own them? And because if you have an asset, if there's an infrastructure that you're building and it's with the women, it gives them not just the economic power or the advantage, it also builds their social capital, a place in the society, a position for them, a decision-making power going forward. So how do you build all of these so that there is climate resilient solutions with women at the center? And how do you build this capital going forward with the girls who are also being trained and skilled, reskilled and upskilled? So I think I would like to stop there, and with the thought that we should talk more about women-led entrepreneurships, women at the leadership positions, women designing the policies, which is no longer a men bastion. Forgive me for saying that. But yes, women need to have that power to say what they want to see in the policies. And I think it is time that we need to take a relook at the national policy on skill development and entrepreneurship and build a whole narrative around green jobs and green entrepreneurship, eco-entrepreneurship for women. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Swayam. I want to leave some time. We have about 15 minutes for questions. But for people who've been following all this, some very interesting links in the chat. Okay, so some of the questions you're asking, etc., I think will be answered if you look at the chat. So I'm just going to take a couple of questions. One or two are directed to people, but some are just general, and I will let you put your hands up, speakers, to decide who will answer them. So there's a question from George Williams for Dr. Garima to know what, to ask whether your recommendations address women in the informal economy enough. You know, the people that were talked about by the SEWA. There's agreement with the idea of indebtedness and the importance of microcredit, and also adding the idea of social protection. Then there is, how can states, this seems to be a general one, how can states in India adopt regeneration framing as a climate solution through women's self-help groups, as Andhra has been doing? And what kind of strategy should one adopt to collaborate between different states and get international funding? Big question, but perhaps someone can answer it very briefly. A general question, what does enabling environments look like in a climate transition context? What does it look like? What does it require? I think there have been attempts to answer that, but maybe some more. I think that's all I have. Eleonora or Kamya, do you see any other questions?
There are more questions, but maybe we should start with them
Okay, sure.
and then we can turn to others.
And could I ask the speakers, our panelists, to be fairly brief? So, Garima, you might want to take the first one since it was addressed to you, and then we can allow anyone else to put up their hands.
No, very happy to. Thanks, Naila, and thanks, George, for your question. So I'm reading it right now, and first, I'd just like to quickly address the first part of the question, which is about Bangladesh versus India, and the differences in the female labor force participation patterns. So that's because of structural transformation. Bangladesh has had a transition from agriculture to manufacturing. It has a sizable manufacturing sector. Naila would be able to speak more about that than anyone else. But in India, that didn't quite happen. In India, the experience has been that we've kind of shifted from agriculture to services, but the manufacturing bit got left out. And so far as a lot of manufacturing opportunities, like in Bangladesh, around garments, are female dominated and therefore provide opportunities for women along the way that I was speaking. That hasn't been the experience of India. And the second part of the question about that informal economy being the mainstream and the female labor force participation rates, and my presentation kind of missing that. I completely agree that informal economy is mainstream. In fact, I think that the way that the ILO defines green jobs, which is decent jobs that preserve and restore the environment, really doesn't apply to any of our contexts in the global South and India in particular. But I just want to point out that the most of those figures were from the National Sample Survey, which does measure the informal economy. There might be limitations in the way that it does, but it does measure the informal economy. So, and in terms of, the kinds of young women that I was talking about, I'm not talking about formal jobs. I'm talking about young women who are training to become, do different kinds of jobs like electricians or electronic mechanics, et cetera, but they're all mostly in the informal economy. So hopefully that answers George's question.
Okay. Any of the other panelists want to take up some of the other questions?
May I take up on the enabling environment question, which is there? And I think couple of things that I would really like. What do we mean by an enabling environment? And if you look at, financial markets, if you look at export markets and trade, if you look at startups, if you look at technology, if you look at research and development, it is all geared towards the mainstream, which is the formal sector. And I think the first and the foremost, which I think comprises in an enabling environment, is investing in organizing the poor and the women workers. It's a process. And therefore, one has to invest in, give investment of time and resources. So that's the first and the foremost. And second is that we also need to look at local decentralized supply chains, which are owned and managed by the women themselves. Everybody wants to invest only in SME. They need to look at, a dollar plus rate of return. But how do you also invest in risk sharing so that it enables the women and the poor to scale up their enterprises as well, and they just don't remain tiny and small enterprises. And the last and the important thing of an enabling environment is it is high time we think of new financing instruments. How do we have a blended pool of finance? So you're not talking of either equity or debt or a grant, but it's a blended pool, which then enables the tiny and the small to unlock capital from the mainstream market. So I think that is what, so how do you build organizations which are owned and managed? And these are some of the aspects of enabling environment. And may I also answer the regenerative farming question, which comes from
spite of the title.
And I think why has it succeeded only in Andhra Pradesh and not in other parts of India? That's a question that one needs to really address. And therefore, I think it calls for a bottom-up approach. So because India has so many agroclimatic zones. And, universalization definitely is needed, but you need to give some flexibility depending on the agroclimatic zones. And the most important is a systems change. There are structural barriers in our country. Women do not own land. There's absolutely no way that women can own land in their own name. So unless and until we think about these structural changes and systems change that is required, I don't think regenerative farming could be scaled up. And the last and the most important is that it's, corporate and contract farming versus small farm holder farming. If we push for contract and corporate farming, I think the push is going to be for, hybrid seeds, GM seeds, chemical fertilizers. Where is then, how do we compete with, those large corporations to talk about regenerative farming? So I'm not against regenerative farming, please don't misunderstand. But unless if you address these systems changes and structural barriers, it's going to take a long time to scale up regenerative farming. Thank you.
Thank you. Swayam, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add what Reema ji just said, which is essentially like when you talk about green jobs and transition, we normally are not at the same level of definitions. So I think how do you define green jobs, and the process of just transition needs to be defined. And that is where the whole, as Reema ji said, the structures and the system changes actually stems from that. Because if you do not understand what they are, you won't know what barriers you need to remove and what are the enabling systems that you need to pull in. So probably that alignment or synergy within the policymakers, academicians, practitioner needs to be built in the forefront. The second aspect I just wanted to bring to everybody's highlight is essentially that there is the ILO report, which is just a very recent one that I was looking at. It was in February just this February 2024. The policy brief actually highlights that there is an uneven readiness across India with both green jobs and the process of a just transition towards an environmentally sustainable economy and society. And I think that report says a lot. And the first thing it says that the definitions and the information guidance on green jobs, transitions is unclear. The kind of skilling that you need is unclear. We need to kind of define that as well. And putting gender equality at the heart of just transition then becomes imperative. So that is what was, I just wanted to add to what Reema ji said. So all policy, everything that we do needs to have a policy connect to it, because if you don't have that, if there are no supporting institutions or a coherence at a top, then all the work that we do at the grassroots remains there. It needs to kind of accelerate and match with that just transition, that scale that we are thinking. So it has to merge somewhere. So probably we need to think at a more coherent and an integrated approach. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Kabeer, are there any questions that I should be picking up on?
No, the rest has many comments. So
Many comments. Okay. Yeah. So I think we could, may I just end with a couple of comments that have struck me. Swayam, when you talked about there was no data, right? You had to go and find, pardon?
Disaggregated data.
No disaggregated data, fine. And one of the things I think is that, we have very uneven data availability in most countries of the global south. The data that is collected is driven by quite powerful interests. And those interests are in the most profitable areas of the economy. Where we have not sought data is very often in areas that are not so profitable, scavenging coal or, growing a homestead cultivation and all that. Now, with the dynamic introduced by needing to race against climate catastrophe, we have to change our data collecting direction. We have to look for those areas where there are promises for, sustainable livelihoods. And hopefully that will address poverty and some of the people that Sohini was talking about, having to borrow money to deal with catastrophes not of your own making. So that was one point that really struck me, is why don't we have this kind of data and why is it not disaggregated? And I think the second point for me was from Garima, and this idea, and I agree with her, that, whether we're talking about green jobs or non-green jobs or whatever kind of jobs we're talking about, there are some resilient barriers to women entering the kinds of jobs that they might want to. Some of it is to do with that unpaid, that baby on her back, right? But it is also to do with discrimination and so on. So while we're talking about transition from, not so clean to a clean environment, we cannot lose sight of those barriers, but we have to also adapt our practices, our responses to what a clean, green economy needs. So we need to, have education of the most fundamental kind across the board. We need to find what kinds of skills will be important. We need to dismantle discrimination, whether it's in the law or in the community. So those sort of things are kind of ongoing, no matter what kind of an economy we're looking for. So I think for me, those are two general points. What's driving data collection? And what is driving the gender segmented nature of the economy? So I think I've taken up our last few minutes. So let me end by thanking our speakers, our wonderful speakers, Reema, Karima, Suravi, Sohini, and Swayam, for a very excellent set of presentations. And let me thank our audience also for their engagement, for their contributions, and for their questions. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Naila ji, for giving us enough time and space. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Namaste.
Bye-bye.